Okay, good evening, everyone, and nice to see you. And sorry again for the delay due to the technical glitches. So I wanted this week to look at a very difficult and mysterious parsha at the end of the Sedra. It's the parsha of a conversation that takes place between Miriam and Aaron about Moshe and Moshe's wife. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells them off for what they said, but exactly what they said and what the issue was is really very unclear. And I really just wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at the Mefarshim on this parsha and trying to understand it. For those who don't have the handout sheets, I put in the chat group. I put the handout link if people want to download it from there. Alternatively, you can just look in a Chumash and Rashi, and you'll have most of them. You'll have most of the sources there. There's a lot to talk about in the parsha, and when I was preparing for the shiur, I actually ended up splitting the shiur into three. So I have a shiur prepared for the next 3 years on the topic, because there's so much really to say. There's several stages to the story. Stage one is Moshe and Aaron speaking. Stage two is, in fact, there's two psukim really that describe what they say. Pasuk Aleph and Pasuk Beis of Perek Yud Beis of the 12th chapter. Then there's a third pasuk which speaks about the humbleness of Moshe, seemingly irrelevant. And then there's a fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh bracha, etc., pasuk, etc., in which Hashem comes to the defense of Moshe and tells off Aaron and Miriam for them speaking. And again, Hashem gets into a seemingly side topic in which he says Moshe is very humble and Moshe is faithful to me, and I speak to him mouth to mouth in a vision, not in riddles. And he begins speaking about the nevuah of Moshe, the prophecy of Moshe, not seemingly connected to the story. And then the remaining psukim, pasuk Tes through to the end of the Perek, it talks about Miriam as opposed to Aaron's punishment. So there's a lot going on here that needs unpicking. Is it Aaron and Miriam who are being told off, or only Miriam? What exactly do they say about Moshe? What exactly is their sin? Is their sin of Lashon Hara, or is their sin of lack of appreciation of Moshe as per Hashem's defense of Moshe? It's all a little unclear. We'll try and get through whatever we have time to get through, but I wanted really just to start off by learning Rashi, because like with so much else, Rashi informs us and almost programs how we read the psukim. So we're so used to reading the psukim through the eye of Rashi that we assume this is really the only reading in the psukim, but actually there's several different ways to read it, and we'll try and look at some of them Mefarshim. And today's show really is not going to be discussing the wider theological issues about what Hashem is saying about Moshe's prophecy and why they get punished and how they get punished, which Hashem will be the topic for next year's shiur. It's simply just what are they saying about Moshe. I also chose this topic a little bit because a character called an Isha Cushis, a Cushite woman, features in this. And one of the topics floating around this sequence of psukim is how is it relevant that she's a Cushite woman, generally to be understood as someone of black color, black skin color. Rashi even references that. It's generally understood that the word Cush refers to those who are black, and we're aware in the at the moment going on in the world, the death of a tragic death of another human being has triggered a real process of soul searching and a lot of upset about how we have treated and continue to treat, and how the black community continues to be treated. And again, I emphasize, I'm not really making a political point here. I'm not talking about civil rights in America. I'm not talking about this particular incident and what happened there, and was the force excessive and not. These will have to be decided in a court of law. And I'm not here talking about looting and rioting, but I'm simply talking about human beings who are hurting and who have a terrible and painful history of mistreatment. And our world was part of that. There's no doubt. There were Jews involved in this, and we as a community, like everyone else, really need to get our act together and hear and empathize with what other people are telling us about their experiences. And their experiences are often exceptionally painful, and hundreds of years, centuries of terrible persecution. And this isn't really about, as I said before, Shabbos isn't about one-upmanship and working out who suffered more. Did the Jews suffer more? Did they suffer more? How have we dealt with it? How have they dealt with it? It's not a sort of a competition. It's not that acknowledging their suffering somehow diminishes our own difficult history. It's simply about decent human empathy with what other people are going through. And there definitely are chazals around the topic of race which deserve to be spoken about a little bit. And this is one of the Mara Makomas around this topic, and therefore, again, I thought this was an interesting thing to look at. There are many chazals that speak very profoundly and importantly about Kovat Abrius, about every human being being created with Tselem Elokim. There's a Mishnah that tells us why was Lama Odom Nivra Yechidi? Why was the human being created alone? Meaning, why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu found all humanity with descent from one human being? Why can he create several founding fathers and mothers of humanity? And that would have also worked well. And Chazal give a number of answers to this question. One answer to the question is very famous. It's to teach us that kol matzil nefesh achas, whoever saves one life, is ke'ilu hitzel kol olam, as if you saved the whole world. Because out of one human being, we see the potential for the whole world comes. Chazal give another answer to this question. And they say, Lama Nivra Adam Yechidi, why was the person created alone? And the answer to the question is that no one can say, my ancestor was greater than your ancestor. And this is the ultimate cry against racism, really. No human being should be able to look at someone else and say, I come from a different lineage to you, that there's genuinely different sorts of human beings. We're all ultimately brothers and sisters. So this is something that deserves to be said, but in the context of this year, we're really just trying to learn the psukim and see what they say. So we start off with the first pasuk, pasuk Perik Yud Beis pasuk Aleph, and it's on the sheets if anyone hasn't got them. Vatadaber Miriam v'Aaron b'Moshe. Miriam and Aaron spoke b'Moshe, against Moshe perhaps. Al Beis normally means in or about, a little unclear. Al Oidos ha'isha ha'kushis asher lokach, about. Presumably the word al-odos, not a super common word, but presumably, and the Gemarians talk about this, presumably it means regarding. I put the translation here with a question mark. Ha'isha kushit asher lokach, the Cushite woman that he had taken, and then it seems to repeat itself, ki isha kushis lokach, because he had taken an isha kushis. So Rashi picks up on a number of details in this pasuk. The first point is, who says they're saying anything negative here at all? It just says they spoke about the Isha Kushis. It doesn't tell us if this is positive or negative. What leads us to believe that this is a story of Lashon Hara at all? The next pasuk says, did Hashem only speak to Moshe? He also spoke to us. But again, it's not clear that we're dealing here with the story of Lashon Hara at all. And Rashi answers this question by picking up on the word daber. And he says, Ein dibur b'chol mokem en lashon kosher. The word dibur always means a harsh sort of speech. We mentioned this actually last week, conveniently, when we spoke about Bechas Koyanim, where the language uses Omer Lohem. And I mentioned then that Amira means when there's a connection to someone else. Amira is in conversation, is in talking, when you're talking to someone else. Dibur is when the issue is the matter or the fact objectively in and of itself, as opposed to adapted to the listener. Dibur is probably related etymologically to davar, the object itself. So when I'm talking about the object as it is, there's a harshness about it. I'm not adjusting how I'm speaking to what the listener is able to hear and understand. The translation of the very famous psukim that we have throughout the Torah, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe Leimer, is a little bit difficult to understand. But one of the many meanings that it may have is Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying the davar, the object itself, but Leimer, that it should then be said over in a manner that is appropriate for the audience. So Dibur, Rashi says, has connotations of harshness, and from this we see that what the conversation going on here is not an Amira, but is a Dibur. The second thing Rashi picks up on, really trying to lay the groundwork for understanding the end of the Parsha, which is where Miriam, but not Aaron, is punished. And Rashi says that Miriam is the prime mover over here. Vatadaber Miriam v'Aaron. He poscha b'dibur techila. She spoke first. She opened the conversation. So even though this is a dual conversation, Nonetheless, Miriam starts it, and therefore her name is mentioned first. Now Rashi doesn't pick up on or doesn't explicitly mention, perhaps this is where Rashi's coming from. Rashi mentions that Miriam's name is said first. Rashi doesn't say or point out that the verb used here also seems to indicate that this is what's going on. In the next pasuk, in pasuk base, it says vayomru. So here it's the word amira, and it's in the plural. They said, etc., etc. But in pasuk aleph, in the first pasuk, it says vatadaber Miriam va'Aaron. Now, the grammatical form when you're talking about two people shouldn't be vatadaber in the singular, and it's also interesting that it's vatadaber in the feminine form. So it should have perhaps been vayadabru Miriam va'Aaron, or vatadaber Miriam im Aaron. So the grammatical form is a little difficult over here. It would seem to indicate that the verb is going on Miriam, and therefore the literal meaning is, and she, Miriam and Aaron, spoke. So how do you have that form? And after all, it must be a dual conversation. Is this Miriam speaking to Aaron? But that's not quite what the pasuk says. The next pasuk says Vayomu. They're both speaking. They're both partners in this, and therefore Rashi understands that they are both partners in this indeed. Nonetheless, Miriam is the prime mover, and whether Rashi's diuk is only, as he says explicitly, from Miriam's name being mentioned first, or it's from also the grammatical form of vatadaber, remains a little unclear, but that seems to be the reading in the pasuk. And then Rashi carries on that Miriam meant well by speaking. Nonetheless, she is punished for this. Okay, so this is the second sequence, the second set of comments of Rashi. Now, what exactly did Miriam say? So Rashi here, very, very interesting Rashi. Rashi, who after all is meant to be the master of Peshat, here gives a midrashic reading. The simplest meaning of the pasuk is they spoke about the Cushite woman that Moshe took. Isha Cushis means Isha Cushis. That's it, a woman from Cush. However, that's not how Rashi translates it. Rashi says, so Isha Cushis, Magid shal kol moedim b'yafya, teaching us that everyone acknowledged her beauty. Kashem shal kol moedim b'shachruso shal Cushis. In the same way as Cushi, in the same way as everyone understands or everyone notices or acknowledges the blackness of a Cushite. And then Rashi brings a gematria, very unusual for Rashi. Cushis b'gematria yefas mareh. Cushis is in gematria yefas mareh, someone of beautiful appearance. So Rashi gives a double indication that the translation of this pasuk is they spoke regarding the beautiful woman who Moshe had taken, and for some reason or other, the pasuk tells us this using the language of a Cushite woman. How does a Cushite woman come to mean a beautiful woman? Says Rashi, both alluded to in the gematria, and a Cushite woman means a woman of unusual, outstanding appearance. Not unusual, sorry, Rashi, but outstanding appearance. An appearance that's obvious to everyone, just like a black woman is outstanding to everyone, that they notice immediately her color. In the context of a world in which Cushites aren't common, this is outstanding appearance. Similarly, everyone notices the outstanding appearance of Miriam. So this is a metaphorical language. It's language that was used. It would appear that that's how language was used in Rashi's understanding. Every language has its own sort of dynamics. And what in one language can seem like a strange use of language, in another language can mean a positive use of language. I was actually once speaking about this Rashi to someone who comes from Italy. I don't know if we have any native Italian speakers in our audience, but I was speaking to someone who comes from Italy, and they were saying how when you translate from language to language, you can sometimes misuse phrases because they can mean things in different languages. And they said that in Italy, when you refer to a woman as being cow-like, that is considered a compliment. That's a compliment as to someone of pleasing appearance and so on. And it just hit me. They were saying this in reference to Rashi, how hard it is to cross-translate terminologies. What in one language can be an insult, another language can be a compliment. And here, Kushi, Rashi understands in Rosh Hashanah just is used for someone of who is distinctive, is the word I was looking for before. Someone's distinctive appearance, and therefore it's used as a sort of borrowed language for saying she's a woman of outstanding beauty. Now, why does Rashi say this? What leads Rashi to kvetch, to give this forced translation in the pasuk. We don't know. Rashi doesn't tell us, but there is a very blatant problem over here, which is how can the pasuk tell us they spoke about the Isha Kushis who Moshe married when we know well who Moshe married? And how do we know who Moshe married? Because there's a whole parsha earlier in the Torah in which it tells us about Moshe turning up in Midian and marrying the daughter of Yisro, who is a Midianite, and she is Zipporah, the wife of Midian. Now, Midian and Cush can't be further apart. Cush is described in the Torah as a descendant of Chom, so they are from a whole different family to Midian, who are cousins of the Jewish people, who are Semites or descendants of Shem. So how the two can go together? These are people of very far geographical location. Midian is somewhere in Transjordan, Cush is somewhere in Africa. How on earth do the two link together? And this is the problem that Rashi is bothered by. How can they say that she took a Cushite woman when we know that his wife was not a Cushite, and therefore they understand it to mean, Rashi understands it to mean a beautiful woman. And that's how Rashi learns the Psukim. What is their complaint? Well, what's wrong with this? Why are they speaking against Moshe for marrying Zipporah? What's wrong with Zipporah? Now, again, we get back to this word al-odos. The word al-odos could be about the Cushite woman, in which case they're speaking really about her, and they have some objection to her. Maybe she's not a suitable wife for Moshe. That's not how Rashi translates the word al-odos. Rashi says al-odos isha al-odos gerusheha, concerning her divorce. And this is the famous pshat of Rashi, that they understood that Moshe has separated from Zipporah. They then say ki isha kushis lokach. Why the repetition of an isha kushis? Answers Rashi, what does this mean to say? Says Rashi, ma talmud loma, el yeshecha isha noya b'yofya v'eina noya b'masel v'lo b'yofya v'zois noya b'kol. It repeats that she is an isha kushis to emphasize not only is she beautiful externally, but she's beautiful internally. And therefore, what on earth could Moshe's problem be with her? She's an absolutely suitable match. How can Moshe separate himself from his wife? And this is what they are saying about Moshe. So this is Rashi's reading the Psukim. We don't have time now to go through the continuation of the Parsha, but based on this, basically their critique of Moshe is, why does he separate himself from his wife? And Hashem's defense of Moshe is, you don't understand, Moshe is different. They say in the next pasuk, we're also prophets. Don't claim that the spiritual status of prophecy means that one can't remain married. This is a contradiction somehow to marriage. That's not the case. The spiritual status of prophecy does not contradict marriage. We are perfectly happy as Nevi'im, as prophets, and yet we're married. Why on earth would Moshe be different? And the answer is that Moshe is different. Moshe is someone who, his spiritual stature is such that he can't engage in normal life, in normal marital life, and therefore he is justified to divorce, or separate rather, from Zipporah. So this is how Rashi learns the sequence of Psukim. This is not about the Cushite woman suggesting she's unsuitable for Moshe. This is against Moshe regarding, al-odos means regarding the Cushite woman, but not against the Cushite woman. And secondly, it's not Isha Kushis that she's a Cushite woman, it's that she is a beautiful woman. Now I must tell you, this pshat has a long history of reading the Psukim. It's not only Rashi's Chiddush, the Targum Unclus really already translates the pasuk in this way. Rav Tzaddik Gaon in his Parsha and Halacha, so the Gaonim, we're going back several generations before Rashi. Unclus takes us back all to the times of Chazal. This is a very early translation of the Psukim, in which Cushite is translated as a beautiful woman, based presumably on this question of why she would be referred to as Isha Kushis. However, there are other pshatim in the pasuk, and I just want to share with you a couple of other readings. And the next pshat is one that I printed in source 2, which comes from the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra says, "Hayosha ba'enai." The pshat that seems to me the most reasonable, "Shezu hakushis hi Zipporah." That Kushis is a way of referring to Zipporah. Kihi Midyanis, because she is a Midianite, or Midyanim heim Yishmaelim, and the Midyanim are Yishmaelim, V'im Dorim ba'oyanim, and they live in tents. And he quotes a pasuk in Habakkuk, which I'll read out to you shortly. V'chein Kosov, and so the pasuk says, Yigazun Urias Eretz Midian, the curtains of the lands of Midian tremble, referring to the fact that they live in tents. Ubavor Choma Shemesh, and because of the heat of the sun, Einam Lovan Klal, their skin loses its white color. And therefore Tzipora was very weather-worn and dark-skinned because of her outdoor lifestyle, and therefore was similar in appearance to a Cushit. So here Ibn Ezra, when he says that Midian and Yishmaelim are the same thing, he doesn't mean that they are the same thing. We know again from the Psukim, this is not the case. Yishmaelim are descendants of Yishmael, descendants of Avram. Midianim are a different people entirely. He simply means to say they are Bedouin. They are tent dwellers. And he brings a sequence of Psukim he brings a reference rather to Habakkuk, in which we see, he doesn't quote actually the beginning of the Pasuk, but he says, Tachas oven ro'isi aralei kushan. This is Habakkuk in chapter Gimel. I've seen the tents, and then it references Yigs and Urias Eretz Midian, the curtains, the fabrics of Midian flap. That means to say these are the tent fabrics that are in Midian, because you see that Midianites dwell in tents. And then the psukim there in Habakkuk carry on, Zchorani, I am black, etc. In other words, the Kushim, the Midianim, have darkened skin due to their outdoor lifestyle. Now, interestingly, therefore, based on this reading, carries on Ibn Ezra and says, V'tam ki isha kushis zakachas, the explanation of the continuation of the pasuk in which it says, because he took a Cushite wife, is part, he says, Thou dibur shadibra Miriam. And this is part of what Miriam is saying, that she's saying he took a Cushite wife, why now has he separated from her? The last words of Ibn Ezra, so they suspect Moshe of separating from his wife Zipporah because Isha Kushis, because she has a weather-worn skin. She comes from a tent-dwelling people, and this has affected her appearance, and therefore Moshe separated because he no longer finds her beautiful. And they are leaping to the defense of Zipporah and saying, what terrible behavior this is of Moshe, that he is separating from his wife because of physical appearance, because he no longer finds her beautiful, because she is a tent dweller. She comes from Midian and has taken on the appearance of the Ishmaelim, of the Bedouin, who live an outdoor lifestyle. So this is how the Ibn Ezra learns Pshat in the Pasuk. This is a reference to Zipporah. Now there's a very interesting third reading in the Psukim, which I printed here in source 3, which comes from a relatively unknown Rishon called Ibn Kaspi. This is Yosef Ibn Kaspi. He came from Provence, which is in the south of France. We mentioned it many times. He died in, we're talking here about the late 1200s, the early mid-1300s. Died in Majorca, and he wrote a Parsha on the Torah. He's a very interesting man. He was very philosophically inclined. He wrote a number of piyutim that have entered into tefillah. He wrote a vast number of Sforim, not all of which we have. He's very interested actually in the Rambam's Masorah. He traveled to Egypt to meet the descendants of the Rambam. We're here talking about a century after the death of the Rambam. He was interested in meeting, more than a century after the death of the Rambam, he was interested in meeting the descendants of the Rambam and learning Torah from them. He arrived in Egypt and he was very disappointed. He found that the way he says it is, he said the descendants of the Rambam had lost the Masorah, the tradition of their great ancestor, and were no longer Maimonideans, and he wasn't able to fulfill his desire from learn from them. And he says a fascinating pshat. He says that I think over here he says it's irresolvable. There's no way to resolve Isha Kushis with Zipporah. And actually, he says, I struggle with understanding the other pshatim that we've got. There's pshatim that say that Isha Kushis refers to Devorah. He says, Chas v'shalom to do this to the, refers to Zipporah. He says, Chas v'shalom to do this to the Torah. To say that the Torah says one thing and it means exactly the opposite, that's not reading Torah. He says this is like a distortion of Torah. He's very bothered by this. And he says, as if someone would say, the pasuk says, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, and we translate it as, God forbid, hate Hashem. This is a terrible distortion of Sukkim. I missed out the quotes. I didn't put the quotes in full. He says, Chalila, Chas v'shalom, to say this. And he says, don't even claim that this is a tradition in Torah Sheba'al Peh, in which we have some sort of tradition about what this means. Because Torah Sheba'al Peh can't convert the meaning of a pasuk to exactly the opposite. And he says, this refers to a second wife that Moshe took. This is referring to another woman that he married, a Cushite woman that Moshe married. And this is indeed their objection. He says their objection wasn't that he separated from his wife, but rather they were saying, why did he take a second wife? What's the need for this this second wife? They spoke about Moshe. Why has he taken this second wife? And he reads very beautifully. If we look back in the first pasuk, he reads very beautifully into the first pasuk. Where do we know that Moshe took a second wife? From nowhere, only from this pasuk itself. This is the double language here. Moshe, Aaron and Miriam spoke about the Cushite wife that Moshe had taken. Where did he take a Cushite wife? The pasuk tells us because he had previously taken a Cushite wife, and as you should know, he had taken a Cushite wife. So the pasuk is answering the question of who is this Cushite woman that they're speaking about. The pasuk is filling it in and saying you should know he had taken a second wife. And the reason I find this interesting is because it gets us to the fascinating issue of lost medrashim and medrashim that we do have and that we don't have. Who was this Cushite woman that he took? So in source 5, the Targum Yonason mentions very briefly when he married this Cushite wife, and it says when Moshe fled from Paro, they made him king over them, and he distanced himself from there. He says that Moshe, the missing years of Moshe's life, he wandered over many countries, and he landed up in Cush for a time. And this is built upon the fact that the truth is the first time we encounter Moshe, he's pretty much 80. He's there at the burning bush, being given the mission to go and speak to Paro. What happens in his early 80 years? What did he do during this time? Well, we know one incident in which he turns up at Midian and he ends up marrying Zipporah, the daughter of Yisro. But what else did he do in this time? All we know about him is that he grows up in Paro's house. Vayigdal, he grows up. He goes out and sees the Mitzri. He kills the Mitzri. He has to run away. Presumably, he's a young man when that happens. Vayigdal, he's just grown up. It's in the early stages of him going out to see what goes on amongst the Jewish people. And immediately, he flees. Where does he go during these missing years? Now, we have a tradition here, which I printed in source 4, from the fascinating figure called Josephus. Josephus was a Jew who lived at the time of the Churban Beis HaMikdash. He initially fought against the Romans in the battle to achieve independence. He was a miyuchas. He had distinguished descent from Kohanim, from the Hashmonaim family, and he was one of the great survivors of all time. He was one of these people who, no matter what happens, always landed on his feet. He was involved in the famous story in Yodfat, which was besieged by the Romans. The members agreed to commit suicide by lottery, and Josephus managed to arrange things that the lottery, he was the last for the lots to land on, and therefore he ended up not committing suicide. His Hebrew name was Yosef ben Matisyahu. He gets imprisoned by Vespasian, and then he tells Vespasian that he's had a prophecy. And in this prophecy, he's told that Vespasian is going to become a very great emperor, and that the Jews are being punished by Hashem for their Averos. Vespasian is delighted to hear this, and he frees Josephus from captivity. Josephus takes Vespasian's surname on. Henceforth, he's known as Flavius Josephus. That's the surname of Vespasian. And he goes on and becomes a Roman citizen, and so on and so forth. So whilst he appears to have been a Jew in good standing in the sense that he kept Torah and mitzvahs, his reliability is a little bit questionable. But anyway, in source 4, I just printed for your interest, he tells a whole story about who Moshe encountered, who these Cushites are who Moshe has encountered, and how Moshe ended up marrying this Cushite princess. So a story that we only have very briefly in the Targum Yonason, Josephus has at great length. And there's no reason to assume that this source is unreliable. Presumably he's quoting to us a medrash that he had, which elaborates on the story. We have other medrashim, again, which aren't of such clear yichus, like the Sefer Yosha, which also elaborate on this story. Now, The other interesting thing about this version of events in the Ibn Kaspi is that he says that Moshe certainly did live a normal married life with his wife. And Ibn Kaspi says that in Yiddishkeit, in Torah, we're not meant to remove ourselves from this world. We're not meant to have asceticism and monasticism. We're meant to be engaged in the world. And therefore, to argue that Moshe separated himself, this would be a contradiction to what we mean by true Kedusha. The other Rishonim, Rashi, takes on exactly the opposite. That Moshe did separate himself. He didn't live a normal married life. He divorced and separated himself from his wife. And that was the Lashon Hara they were speaking about him. And Hashem's defense is, no, Moshe is different. Moshe is an exception. The Rashbam, that we don't have time to see inside today, learns similarly that the Isha Kushis is indeed a Cushite woman, and that the criticism of Moshe is that he never married her. He didn't continue to be married to her. However, the Ibn Kaspi says, at the end of the piece that's printed over here, he says, "V'osif b'zeh ha'ora," this is in source 3, that in our Torah we believe that humans are meant to engage with completion and perfection in this world. So what you have here is a fascinating discussion about the status of Moshe. According to the other Rishonim, and this is Hashem's defense of Moshe, Moshe is the one-off exception. Moshe is different to everyone else. The Abarbanel, who criticizes Ibn Kaspi's Mahalach, Moshe is different. Moshe is someone who achieved near angel status or angel status. Moshe is the one human being who doesn't have to live a normal physical life. And that indeed was the mistake of Miriam and Aaron, the Lashon Hara they spoke about them, and that was the defense that Hashem came to Moshe's defense. Ibn Kaspi is agreeing with Moshe and with Miriam and Aaron, and Ibn Kaspi is saying, no, of course Moshe lived a normal married life, because there's no idea in Yiddishkeit of ruchnius or spirituality being achieved by separation. So we've run out of time for this half of the shiur, but very briefly, what we have managed to see is broadly speaking, 3 mahalchim in the psukim. We have, or 4 really, 3.5 pshatim in the psukim. We have Rashi, who says she is Isha Kushis, means a beautiful woman, and their complaint against Moshe is she's beautiful in externally, she's beautiful internally, she's a special person. Why has he separated from her? We have the Ibn Ezra, who learns that she is Sipporah, and they worry that he's separated because of her physical appearance. She's weather-beaten, she's a Midianite, she's a tent dweller, she's has an outdoor life, her skin has become rough, and that's why Moshe separated, and they're horrified. How can the leader of the Jewish people, like a Moshe Rabbeinu, behave in such a manner? And we have the Ibn Kaspi, the Targum Yonason, and the Rashbam, who say this Isha Kushis is a new woman, a separate wife, and they argue over what the criticism of Moshe is. Is it that Moshe isn't living a normal life with her, and that's the criticism, or that Moshe is living a normal life with her, and that's what they're saying. Why on earth does Moshe need a second wife? These are 2 slants on this mysterious, missing 50, 60, 70 years of Moshe's life, which according to Midrashim that we don't really have in much detail, but Josephus brings down or hinted at in the Targum Yonason, Moshe spent time living outside Midian, outside Mitzrayim, in the land of Cush, and had a whole life about which we know nothing much. Again, interesting discussions we had on another occasion. Why is it we know so little about Moshe? What was Moshe's journey to spirituality? But that again, in Mitzvah Hashem, will be a shiur for another time. So I'll stop there on the Parsha, and we'll shift to talking about Halacha. Unless anyone wants to say anything on what we've said so far on the Parsha, I'll pause just for questions. Otherwise, we'll move straight to Halacha L'maisa. Okay, so we'll shift to Halacha, and we were learning the malachas of Tsoveah. So we were going to learn the malachas of dying on Shabbos. We've shifted now to Hilchos Shabbos, but I decided that going straight into the larger malachas of topics of Shabbos, like Muktzah or Bishul, or other such malachas, these are big malachas, they're a bit overwhelming. So we'll start off with a smaller and simpler malacha, and this is the malacha of Tsoveah. Last week we discussed what we mean by malachas, what the concept of a malacha is on Shabbos, and we very briefly dipped into the topic of Tsoveah, and I mentioned a couple of points. The first thing is that Tsoveah applies to any material, whether it's a solid material like painting metal, whether it's a liquid like colouring water, whether it's a permeable material like colouring leather or wool. In all those cases, the malacha of dyeing, of colouring, applies on Shabbos. Point number 1. Point number 2, the malacha applies whether the dye becomes absorbed in the fabric and you change the color of the whole material itself, like happens when you dye material, or whether it merely cleaves and sticks to the surface of the material and becomes bound to it, like happens if you paint something solid, if you paint metal or something of the sort. The third thing I mentioned is that Tsoveah is different to kosev, even though the two seem to have a commonality, in that kosev, writing, isn't about beautifying the surface upon which I write. It's about lettering or numbering or symbolism, pictures that convey information. It's about the creative act. What have I brought into existence? The creativity of a symbol or a letter or a number that communicates something, that carries content. That's what the Malach of Kosev is. It's about the letter, it's about the symbol. Whereas Tsoveah is about the object that's painted. What creative act have I done? I've beautified, I've coloured the object. In Tsoveah, the material I put on, the painting that I put on, it becomes subsumed to the object upon which I paint it. The whole point is that it facilitates, it serves the object to beautify the object. As opposed to in Kosev, when it retains its own significance because it is a letter or a picture or a number that carries content in its own right, rather than it becoming subsumed to the object, becoming a means of beautifying the object. It retains its own significance. And that's the difference between the two malachas that we're discussing. We're learning about Tsoveah, dyeing, colouring. There's another malacha, which please God we'll learn on another occasion, which is Kosev, which is about the symbol carrying the content rather than colouring the object itself. That means to say, if I paint a picture, the malacha is Kosev. If I paint a wall to colour the wall, then the malacha is Tsoveah. If I already have a picture merely with outline and I fill in the picture, then that may be Tsoveah because I'm merely adding the colour to the picture rather than creating the symbol, because the symbol and the communication already existed through the outline of the picture. So if I have a colouring in book with the outline and a kid's crayons in the colouring, then that may be colours in with crayon, that will paint, that may be Tsoveah. But if I paint the picture from the start, then that would be Kosev because I'm creating the symbol. Now, I want to talk about a few of the halachic principles at work over here in order to understand some of the more modern applications of these things. And I was asked at the end of the last year how halacha deals with modern scenarios. And I'm going to try and take this topic as a springboard actually to look at some of the modern scenarios of colouring. Most of us don't go around dyeing cloths. However, Tsoveah is relevant in our lives. It's relevant when it comes to dipsticks for medical purposes. It may be relevant when we flush the toilet and there's a colouring chemical. I'm not saying these things are or aren't allowed, not yet up to the Psak Halacha, but I'm saying these are things where one would think about colouring. Colouring one's face using makeup and cosmetics, of course, are classic examples of these, and various other scenarios. So let's talk about some of the other halachic principles at work here. Now, min ha-Torah, as far as Torah law is concerned, a melacha has to be a significant creative act, and that means that it is only when it is a permanent act as opposed to a temporary result. And therefore, Tsoveah, like with many other melachas, if it's eino mitkayem, it's eino miskayim, it's not a permanent colouring effect that I've achieved, is not the melacha min ha-Torah. This isn't the melacha midaraisa, because this isn't a long-term creative activity. It's merely a temporary activity, and therefore if it's something which isn't permanent, has no permanence to it, it isn't the melacha as far as Torah law is concerned, it's not significant enough. Now what do we mean by impermanent? So the devil is here in the detail. Unfortunately, nothing in life is permanent. So when we say we're colouring this permanently, we don't mean that it will last forever, but we mean it has some degree of permanence. And that's defined in two different ways. It needs to be permanent in the sense that it will last a reasonable amount of time, number one. And number two, it needs to be permanent in the sense that it can't be removed easily. If it's easily removable, it can just be wiped away. Even though if I don't wipe it away and I just leave it sitting there, it can last 500 years. But nonetheless, it's easily removable, so it has no permanence qualitatively, or it has no permanence quantitatively. It may not be easily removable, but it will fade or disappear very quickly. Then this is not, as far as Torah law is concerned, meleches Tsoveah. It is merely a drabonon. A drabonon obviously means in practical halacha, one actually has to keep it, but it's important to understand that the basis of this is not a D'oraisa prohibition, it's a drabonon position. Now, maybe here I'll clarify why it's important to distinguish between d'oraisa and drabonon. Someone who keeps d'oraisas and doesn't keep drabonons is still mechal Shabbos, is still not keeping Shabbos. Shabbos means that we are keeping all the halachas of Shabbos. Nonetheless, sometimes it is important to understand the conceptual framework behind what is a drabonon and what is a d'oraisa, because it can make differences in terms of instructing a non-Jew to do the malacha for one, or in situations of ill health and pekuach nefesh and other such things. And therefore, it's important for us to understand that this malacha is not d'oraisa, but is a drabonon in a case where it is impermanent. How short term is impermanent? Very unclear. It has to last for some time. Does some time mean merely a day or till the end of Shabbos, or does it mean several weeks or 7 months? Is not clearly defined in halacha. However, if it is very easily something that can be wiped away, or it's something that will only last for a few hours, that certainly is impermanent, and this wouldn't be d'oraisa. So I mentioned already that if I paint metal, for example, even though the paint doesn't become absorbed in the metal, nonetheless this is Tsoveah because it is stuck to the metal. The metal now has a new color to it. Painting or dyeing isn't only when it becomes absorbed into the fabric, but it's even when it is stuck to the fabric. This is now a colored bar because it's painted. This would qualify as Tsoveah min haTorah, as Torah dyeing, Torah coloring, if I use a metal paint, because it will last a long time until it gets chipped away or picked away, and it sticks very well. However, if I use a regular paint, like a children's paint on metal, then this wouldn't qualify as Tsoveah because it's a water-based paint and it can be wiped off very easily, even though it will still sit there. If I don't bother wiping it off, it will remain for any length of time. Nonetheless, this isn't permanent qualitatively because I haven't colored it with a paint that is suitable for the surface under discussion. If it takes a complicated process to remove it, even though not such a difficult one, like needing to use a chemical agent to dissolve it, or a great deal of scrubbing or rubbing or something like that, then this would be Tsoveah midoraisa. Now, if it has absolutely no adhesion whatsoever, then everyone would agree this is mutter. This isn't even osa midrabanon, this is mutter. And the lomdus, the conceptual thinking behind why it would be mutter, if it has no adhesion whatsoever, is that this is simply placing two objects one on top of the other. This isn't Tsoveah. Tsoveah has to involve some degree of binding. The impermanent binding, the binding that's easily wiped off, is still bound, is still stuck to it. However, if it's literally impermanent, it's just something sitting on something else where there's no connection at all, that wouldn't count as Tsoveah. It's simply one object placed on top of another object. If I place a sheet of coloured paper on top of a surface, that's not Tsoveah. It's simply a sheet of coloured paper placed on top of something else. Similarly, if I spill a wine on a tablecloth, it was an accident. It doesn't beautify the tablecloth, so clearly we're not talking about Tsoveah over here. But in principle, wine colouring a tablecloth, since it gets absorbed into the fabric, could be Tsoveah. If I spill wine on a kitchen unit, on the laminate of a smooth surface of a kitchen, that's not even Tsoveah midrabanon, it's nothing. It's true, if I left the wine there, it would sit as a puddle till it evaporates for a long time. Nonetheless, there's no sticking at all. This isn't even an impermanent color. This is simply one thing sitting on top of another thing, and that definitely will not be the malacha of Tsoveah. So this is one principle in the halacha of Tsoveah. A second principle in the halacha of Tsoveah that we're going to need to apply is if I have absolutely no intention to beautify it whatsoever. And certainly where my intention is one of complete disinterest in the effect it's having on the color of the object, if in that case it's both subjectively, meaning in terms of my interest, I have no desire to beautify the object, and objectively, this isn't a beautification of the object, and especially in the case in which this is an impermanent type of colouring, in that case it would be completely mutter and it would be allowed. So even though impermanent colouring we said is osa d'rabanan, however, if it's a situation where both subjectively to me and objectively to most normal people, this isn't something that beautifies it, again, Tsoveah wouldn't be relevant. So an example of that would be maybe a stickier food substance that I put on a plate. maybe something like ketchup or something of the sort, which if it dries, it does leave a stain on the plate. Now, technically, therefore, this isn't the same as spilling a liquid on the laminate. In this case, there is a degree of cleavage sticking between the plate and the ketchup. It is bound to it. And in that case, you could think of there being the melacha midrabanan of Tsoveah. Nonetheless, since this is an unintended side consequence, which I have no interest in the result, I have no interest in the result, this would be mutter. So this is a second halachic principle at work with the concept of Tsoveah. A third halachic principle. Tsoveah has to be, and I hope, I'm aware that this week we'll be sticking to halachic principles, but I hope you will see in the next shiur how we're able to take and apply these principles to a whole variety of common scenarios, which is practical halacha, which I hope will come out of this in the next shiur. But a third principle in Tsoveah is that Tsoveah always has to be adding color or something to the coloring of the recipient object, as opposed to removing color. So Tsoveah can be coloring it, dyeing it, nail painting, for example, I'm adding a color to my nails, or it can be deepening the color that already exists. So adding a nail polish, even when it's a lacquer, which is transparent, nonetheless is bringing out a sheen to the natural color that is there beneath the surface, and therefore in principle could be included in Tsoveah. However, removing the color certainly isn't a problem at all, because removing the color is nothing. It's merely removing a color. That's not Tsoveah. That's no melacha at all. Now, it is true that with some melachas, the removal is as much a melacha as the action. However, this is only with some melachas and not with every melacha, and there's a coherence or a logic behind it. So, for example, with kosev, writing, there is a twin melacha, which is moichik, removing of the writing, because by removing the writing, I'm preparing the surface for something else to be written now. I'm removing the information that I wrote. Or with bainer, building a building, sosa, destroying, dismantling the building, is clearing the ground for something else to be put there. That would be a melacha. However, with Tsoveah, there isn't a twin melacha. If I remove a color, that is simply removal of the color, and therefore there wouldn't be a melacha involved here, and that would be perfectly allowed. So this is a third principle in the melacha. I want to share two more principles in the melacha before we are able to deal with all the halachas that we want to discuss. The next principle I want to discuss is also specific to Tsoveah, and this is a rule spoken about by many of the poskim, that ein Tsoveah ba'ochlim. The melacha of Tsoveah doesn't apply by food items. Now, ostensibly, when you read the poskim, this seems to be a matter of dispute, a clash between the poskim. Some poskim say yesh Tsoveah ba'ochlim, and other poskim say ein Tsoveah ba'ochlim. There is the melacha of dyeing with food items, or there isn't the melacha of dyeing with food items. However, I want to explain that this principle is a one that needs to be understood in order to understand how to apply it correctly, and through that we'll understand why there's this discussion. So the issue we're now facing, which is the fourth principle we're trying to understand in Tsoveah, is does it apply to colouring foods? And there's two reasons why the poskim seem to say that it wouldn't apply to colouring foods. The first reason they say is because you're not really interested in the colour. It's not significant to you. It doesn't really matter. And the second reason they say is because this is by definition a temporary sort of outcome. The principle that we already discussed earlier. If I dye a fabric, the intention is for the fabric to be used many, many times in its coloured form. Even if I plan to throw the fabric out after one use, nonetheless, fundamentally, I've created an object which can be reused. Whereas with food, by definition, food is something which is there created to be used and consumed through its use, and therefore the colouring of the food lacks a significance that colouring other objects have, and therefore this wouldn't be the melacha of Tsoveah. Now, we already said that D'Rabbanan, even an impermanent colouring is asa. However, the reason an impermanent colouring is asa is a classic gezerah. Don't do an impermanent colouring because it's wishy-washy. Is it permanent? Is it not permanent? It's dangerous. However, with food, since it's a clearer border, in this case there wasn't even a D'Rabbanan created, and therefore dyeing food would be mutter if both these conditions are fulfilled. meaning I have no particular interest in the outcome. I'm primarily creating food, even though I am pleased with the aesthetic result that comes out of this. So when one prepares food and creates a meal, a person preparing food who understands food is often conscious of the aesthetic impact of how they're preparing the food. And a pleasant looking plate isn't bland, it's got a variety of colors to it. So the food producer may be conscious of the color that's taking place and they may be happy with the color that results. Nonetheless, this is mutter, since their primary purpose isn't to create an object of color, it's merely food and enhancing of the food that's being created. However, if one does have a genuine intention to create color for the food, because I want the color for color's sake, then everyone would agree that yesh Tsoveah ba'ochlim, that even a food can have the melacha of Tsoveah. And just a couple of 3 examples of this perhaps, or 2 examples, and then I'll discuss a less clear example. A very clear example would be, for example, using food dye to make marzipan fruits. So in this situation over there, it's true that the marzipan fruit is going to be consumed. It's a food item. It's not going to last long, not hopefully if it's good marzipan. Nonetheless, the adding of color is to create an object that appears in a certain way. It's perhaps adding red food coloring to make the body of the strawberry, and then a bit of green to make a leaf on it. And this, therefore, the stalk of the strawberry, and therefore this is Tsoveah with food items, and therefore it would be forbidden because I have a direct interest in the color. The other example of this is discussed in Hilchos Pesach. In Hilchos Pesach, there is a milah, a quality, in using red-colored wine that is red, and therefore someone who primarily wants to drink white wine may want to add a little bit of red wine to it in order to give this the appearance of red, to fulfill the minhag of having red wine, which has various symbolic significance in reminding us of the dam and other such things. So in this case, I'm adding the wine directly to color the white wine, and therefore, again, there is a potential problem of Tsoveah in this case. Because in both these cases, I want the color for the color's sake, as opposed to adding food to create food and being pleased about the color because it's nice aesthetically to have colored foods, which would be mutter. How would one resolve the issue with the wine? The answer is if you already have the white wine in and you add the red wine, then you're coloring the white wine. However, if you have the red wine in first and now you're adding the white wine, you're diluting the color of the red wine as opposed to coloring the white wine, and therefore this would be mutter. So one would need to think through how one's doing it. However, in the marzipan case, I think this would be also, this would be a genuine case of Tsoveah, at least Rabbanon, and possibly, according to some opinions, even Deraisa, because I'm deliberately trying to create something of color. And then there's a border case, which I'm a little unsure as to how to view it, which is, for example, coloring icing. So in the case of coloring icing, certainly the halacha, one shouldn't do so, because one is deliberately creating an icing of a certain color, and one's sole intention is to create that color. Nonetheless, it seems to me that everyone would agree that this is Rabbanon, because my intention at the end of the day is to create a more aesthetically pleasing food, as opposed to something of its own significance. If I'm making an ornate ice cream where I want it to have an appearance and a pattern and something to it, then that would be the same as the marzipan case. However, if I'm just creating icing to give a nice chocolate color, if it's a chocolate flavored ice cream and I want it to look brown to look like chocolate, then maybe this would only be drabanon, unlike the marzipan case, which perhaps is deraisa. So this is the 4th principle with Melaches Tsoveah. It doesn't apply to Ochlim, and in truth, it's a little bit of an adaptation of the previous. It's really an application of the previous principles, because food, as we said, has both these qualities. I'm not creating the color for the color's sake, number 1, and number 2, it's by definition impermanent. It's by definition used up in the consumption process. I'm not making something of use. Food is useful, but it's something that's used and consumed, as opposed to making a new object with a new function and a new functionality to it. The final principle that I want to mention in this context, and then next week, in Yetz Hashem, we will apply these principles to many practical halachic scenarios, is a general principle in Hilchos Shabbos called grama, indirect causation. Now, the definition of grama, the definition of indirect causation, is it has to have 2 features to make something grama, to make something indirect causation. Feature number 1 is that it's indirect. It's not a direct result of the action I'm doing, but there is a further stage that takes place. And feature number 2 is that there needs to be a delay built into the process. And it's important to understand these two elements of groma. I'll give an example of this when I open an oven door. So when I open an oven door, there's two things happening over here, which lead to a result. The result is that the element comes on, but why does the element come on in the oven? Now, if there's a trigger through opening the door, because that's how the oven is hardwired, then through opening the door, I'm directly causing the element to come on. However, if there's a thermostat in the oven, and the oven element comes on because when I open the door, cold air rushes in, and the rush of cold air coming in eventually causes the thermostat to detect the temperature change and cause the oven now to come on, then I have both elements of groma in place. It's indirect causation. My opening the door doesn't cause it. My opening the door causes the air to come in. And the air that comes in now triggers this result, number one. And number two, there's a delay in the process. It's not immediate. And therefore, this is groma. How do we paskin with groma? So Sephardim pretty much hold that groma is mutter, is allowed, though that needs some modification. Ashkenazim in general hold that groma is osa unless there's a significant reason to allow it, such as hefsen rubber, a significant financial loss. However, even Ashkenazim who worry about groma would allow it when it is a very far removed process. And according to many poskim, an oven door opening and the thermostat triggering it to come on, at least with many ovens, is such a significant time delay that it's even less than groma and would be allowed to everyone. However, classic groma we don't allow by itself, has to be in combination with other halachic considerations. Now, applying groma is very subtle, and it's a very difficult area of halacha, working out whether something is caused direct or indirect causation. I'm not going to go into the details now, other than to point out that arguably all Tsoveah has one element of groma to it, or classic Tsoveah has one element of groma to it. How so? Because, well, if I paint a color on, it is true that I'm directly coloring it. But classic dyeing is done by putting a fabric in a vat of liquid, of dye. So am I actually doing the dyeing? Not really. I'm putting the fabric in and then the liquid is doing the dyeing. So I'm not myself doing it directly. I'm putting it into a situation, in an environment in which if it remains there long enough, it will absorb the dye and eventually become colored, and the color will become fast. It will stick well to the fabric and it will become colored. So in each situation of malacha, I need to work out whether groma is inherent to the malacha. I mean, let's take another couple of examples. When I sow a seed in the ground, am I causing the seed to germinate directly? Not really. I'm just putting the seed in the ground and then the germination takes place by itself. In winnowing, I throw the seed with chaff up in the air, and the wind blows, and that separates it off. And the laws of air resistance and wind and gravity cause the lighter chaff to go off and the grains to settle on the ground. So in each case, one needs to work out exactly what the human element of the malacha is. And as I say in Tsoveah, there may be a complication over here, because it may be that some degree of indirect causation is inherent to every malacha of Tsoveah. And this is again something that we will have to think about when we apply these halachas next week. So we've established here the basic principles of Tsoveah. We've spoken about the material, liquid, solid, permeable. We've spoken about whether it's a surface or inherent to the fabric. Either way, it's a malacha. We've spoken about permanence and impermanence, 3 levels: completely permanent deraisa, semi-permanent rabbanon, just sitting on the surface with no degree of permanence, mutter completely. We've spoken about it not being miyapeh if it doesn't beautify the object. I have no interest in it, either objectively or subjectively, like ketchup on a plate, then it's allowed. And then we spoke about a couple of other general principles. We spoke about groma, indirect causation. We spoke about removal of color not being included in the melacha, and possibly that was all. And in Tsoveah Be'ha'alotecha, that food, coloring food, it's not a rule that's absolutely ironclad, but in general, unless I'm trying to create an object of color like colored marzipan, coloring of food is mutter. We'll stop there for tonight. I wish everyone a good evening, and in Mitzvah Hashem, I will resume next week and try and talk about practical application of. I wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.